In September 1873, in Houghton County, Michigan, Euan Triggeric was up to something unusual. At the time, every other homesteader in the Upper Peninsula was constructing their cabins on dry, solid land, far from any water sources. This behavior led his neighbors to doubt his mental state. The 41-year-old immigrant from Cornwall was building his home right on top of a manually excavated well. He placed a wooden hatch, fitted with adjustable vents, at the center of his floor. To everyone else, he was a fool, putting a house over a water-filled pit. As one miner put it, he'll either drown his family or contaminate the well with his own waste. No one had any idea that Euan understood something about groundwater that never freezes. Curious about what occurred when January temperatures fell to minus 37 degrees Celsius? Even with the fire fully extinguished, his cabin never went below 4 degrees Celsius. Don't forget to subscribe and let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from. Euan Triggeric first set foot in Michigan's Upper Peninsula back in the spring of 1869. He belonged to a large influx of Cornish miners who crossed the Atlantic seeking copper and a new future, leaving behind the depleted tin mines of their homeland. He had departed from Redruth, a Cornish village where his family had labored underground for many generations. In those mines, workers gained knowledge about the earth that those living on the surface would never find. Euan had spent 23 years in Cornwall going down into shafts that extended more than 300 meters underground. At the deepest levels, the air maintained a constant temperature all year long. It made no difference if the moors above were scorching in summer or coastal storms raged in winter. The deep shafts weren't the only source of his knowledge about the Earth's thermal properties. There was also the water that plagued every Cornish mine, endless flooding from springs and aquifers below the surface. Pumps operated around the clock to prevent the shafts from filling with water. Every miner was also aware that the water streaming into these tunnels stayed at the same temperature, whether in winter or summer, during dry spells or heavy rains. Spring water surfaced at a steady 11 degrees Celsius, a temperature it had maintained for centuries. Below a certain depth, the ground simply paid no attention to the seasons, and the water moving through it brought unchanging warmth to every location. Miners put this understanding to practical use. Pump houses built above flooded shafts remained warm in winter, thanks to the rising damp air, and underground cavities filled with water served as shelter during sudden cold spells. Whoever grasped the behavior of groundwater understood a basic principle of survival that eluded most people. America had offered opportunity and copper, yet what it actually provided in the rough wilderness of Michigan's Keweenaw Peninsula were winters so harsh that Cornish cold felt mild by comparison. This way of thinking about housing utterly confused Euan. He nearly died during his very first January in Houghton County. He was employed at the Quincy mine and slept in a company boarding house heated by a cast iron stove that blazed continuously through the night. Even so, frost still managed to form on the inside walls. The American miners consumed wood at a shocking pace, waking up at regular intervals to stoke the fires. They were waging a hopeless struggle against temperatures dropping to negative 37 degrees Celsius. Yet, whenever the flames faded near dawn, the indoor temperature fell drastically within 60 minutes. People would wake up to frozen wash basins, with their exhaled breath turning to ice right in front of them. Euan observed all of this with a quiet sense of familiarity. The issue was never the cold itself. Cornwall had shown him that land and water possessed hidden qualities capable of overcoming any winter. Rather, the problem lay in the fact that the Americans erected their homes without any link to the steady temperatures present in the ground underneath. They battled the constantly shifting air rather than cooperating with the earth, which never altered. By 1873, Euan had managed to set aside enough money from his mining salary to buy a 16-hectare property situated 5 kilometers from the town of Hancock. Tucked in a small valley, a dependable spring supplied a stream that stayed unfrozen even in the harshest winter. The water emerging from that hillside spring maintained a constant 11 degrees Celsius year-round. He had measured it in January and again in July, and the results were the same. Beneath his land sat an aquifer holding tens of thousands of liters at a steady temperature, essentially a thermal reservoir capable of tempering any building connected to it. His closest neighbor, a Scottish farmer named Malcolm Sinclair, observed Euan inspecting his land. Euan focused especially on the spring and the damp ground beneath it. Riding over to introduce himself, Sinclair asked, "Are you planning to drain that marshy patch, or are you planning to build over it?" Euan answered, his Cornish accent still heavy after 4 years in America, "I'll dig a well and put my cabin right on top." Sinclair stared at him for a long moment. You'll have water under your floor in Michigan. Winter's water that never freezes. Water that remains at 11 degrees Celsius when the air falls to negative 34 degrees Celsius. That water is what will keep my family alive. The quarrel with his wife Morwenna began the moment Euan showed her where the cabin would be built. He led her to the damp patch of ground where the spring fed the creek. He pointed to the stakes marking the foundation, placed directly over the most waterlogged soil. "You want to build our home above a swamp?" Morwenna said flatly, staring at the waterlogged ground over the well. "I'll dig down to the aquifer and build the cabin around it. The well stays inside beneath a cover in the floor. A water-filled hole in the middle of our home with children? A water-filled hole that stays at 11 degrees Celsius when everything else freezes solid? That water will keep us warm even if the fire goes out." Morwenna had followed her husband across an ocean and half a continent into a wilderness so remote that the nearest doctor was 2 hours away by wagon. She had endured the cramped ship, the rough mining camps, and the isolation of a land where Cornish was heard more often than English. But putting a house over a well felt like a completely different matter, a menace that could swallow up her children in the night. "Wells belong outside," she said quietly, "away from the house, and everyone knows that. The water turns foul if you live over it. Moisture rots the floor, and children can fall in and drown. The water won't turn foul if the well is properly lined and covered. The floor won't rot if I build it correctly, and the children won't fall in." Euan took her hands, explaining that the cover would hold a grown man's weight. In Cornwall, the pump houses built above flooded shafts stayed warm throughout the winter thanks to the water underneath. "I've watched it work, and I know it works." Word of Euan's plan reached Malcolm Sinclair. A few days later, the Scotsman rode over, pretending to return a borrowed tool. He found Euan knee-deep in mud, digging the well shaft that was to sit under his cabin floor. "Triggeric!" Sinclair called down. "The men at the mining office are discussing your cabin. Let them talk. They're saying you've lost your mind. They say you're building over a well, putting water under your floor in a place where it reaches negative 34 degrees Celsius." Sinclair shook his head slowly. "I've seen men try clever ideas out here, and most don't survive their cleverness. This isn't clever, it's Cornish. As the saying goes, every pump house in Cornwall is built over a water source and remains warmer than its neighboring structures. The water retains its heat. So the warmth rises into the building above it? Unlike Míchigan, Cornwall doesn't experience winter extremes. Cornwall is governed by physics, and physics doesn't stop at the border." The showdown at the Hancock General Store took place the following week, when Euan rode in to buy supplies: timber, iron hinges, and rope for the well bucket. He spotted a cluster of miners talking near the counter about his undertaking. That Cornishman is raising his cabin above a well. One claimed he'd dug the shaft exactly where his floor would sit. He says the water will keep him warm. More realistically, it will flood his home or leave his children sick with swamp fever. "No sensible person puts a water source inside their house. I've heard he's installing vents in the cover, planning to let the well air drift up into his living space. He's pulling damp and disease into his home through the floor." Euan said nothing, collected his purchases, loaded the wagon, paid the merchant, and drove back through the autumn afternoon. The miners could laugh and call him crazy, but come January, they'd be up every 2 hours to keep their stoves from going out. Meanwhile, his cabin sat at a constant 4.5 degrees Celsius without ever lighting a fire. The ground held its warmth for anyone who knew how to access it. Euan had lived half his life below ground and knew precisely how to reach it. The knowledge that Euan and Triggeric carried from decades in Cornish mines would later be measured with great accuracy by modern hydrogeologists. These were the same principles miners and well diggers had recognized for generations. Groundwater holds a steady temperature throughout the year, and that stability can be used to regulate any nearby structure. The underlying idea was straightforward physics. In colder parts of the world, once you go roughly 4.5 to 6 meters underground, the Earth's temperature no longer follows the changing seasons. In Míchigan, surface air temperatures can shift by more than 55 degrees Celsius between summer and winter, but groundwater moving through deep aquifers stays steady within a few degrees. No matter what's happening above ground in Houghton County, the constant temperature was close to 11 degrees Celsius. That consistency comes from soil's excellent insulating properties. Summer warmth works its way down slowly, heating upper layers, while the deeper earth remains unaffected. Before that heat actually arrives at the aquifer's depth, autumn has already set in, and the surface begins to cool. The seasonal temperature wave never manages to catch up. At the surface, temperatures fluctuate. Deeper down, the earth remains at roughly the region's mean annual air temperature. Water makes this effect significantly stronger. A cubic foot of water contains about 28 kilograms of thermal mass, and water's specific heat is among the highest of any common material. A well holding a few hundred gallons in metric terms, 1 or 2 cubic meters of groundwater amounts to a massive heat reservoir. The aquifer continuously delivers a flow of thermal energy equivalent in metric units to many megajoules as the groundwater slowly passes through. Euan's design tapped into that reservoir by establishing a direct thermal connection. His well shaft was built up through the cabin floor, capped with a wooden trapdoor, fitted with adjustable vents. When those vents were opened, air from inside the cabin would drop down to the surface of the water. Heat taken from the 11 degrees Celsius water would be released into the living area once more. Functioning like an enormous radiator, the well remained at a constant 11 degrees Celsius. The numbers reflected the fate of an ordinary log cabin under severe cold. Within 3 hours of the fire going out, the temperature could fall from 15.6 degrees Celsius to below 0 degrees Celsius. A 22 degrees Celsius drop occurred because heat escaped via the walls, ceiling, and ground. Yet, if a cabin was thermally linked to an 11 degrees Celsius water supply, its floor could never get colder than that level. Serving as a thermal anchor, the well stopped the disastrous temperature fall that proved fatal for settlers who had no fire. Crucially, the whole system regulated itself. As the indoor air cooled closer to the water's temperature, the exchange of heat diminished. Conversely, when the indoor air became much colder than the water, the heat exchange sped up. The well automatically delivered extra warmth at the cabin's greatest moment of need, smoothing out temperature fluctuations with no manual action required. Euan knew how to handle moisture, which was indeed a valid worry. By adjusting the vents, he could regulate air movement, opening them further during bitter cold when the cabin required the most heat. In mild conditions, he left them partly shut, since a lower humidity level was tolerable. The well's own cover limited undue evaporation, yet permitted warmth to pass through the timber. Concerns about water purity could be resolved in the same fashion. A correctly lined well with a snug lid kept out pollutants from the surface, while the steady, gentle movement of groundwater through the aquifer stopped it from going stale. Across the ages, countless people had safely obtained drinking water from wells located right under their dwellings. Such an arrangement was commonplace in numerous European nations. While his neighbors regarded a well simply as a water supply that should stay isolated from the home, Euan viewed it as a store of heat linked to an endless source. Recharged by moving groundwater, it provided a constant 11 degrees Celsius whenever needed, helping to stabilize any building clever enough to use it. Whereas other huts struggled to hold a decent temperature amid the unyielding chill, his would stay tied to the Earth's steady warmth. The underlying science was sound, leaving construction as the only challenge. Digging got underway in the latter part of May 1873, right after the soil had thawed sufficiently for proper work. Throughout the winter, Euan made preparations. He gathered stones for the well lining and cut wood for the cabin structure. He also devised a ventilated lid that enabled heat exchange without compromising his family's safety. This undertaking demanded far greater attention to engineering than a typical cabin, though the material expenses were barely higher than conventional building. The real cost lay in know-how and exactness. First came the well shaft. Euan excavated manually, and the well-known cadence of pick and spade reminded him of his time in the mines of Cornwall. The topsoil formed a sandy loam, which made the initial 1.2 meters fairly simple. Beneath that, compact clay resisted each dig, yet that very clay proved perfect for sealing the shaft off from surface water impurities. At 2.4 meters, he struck the water table, and groundwater flowed into the hole quicker than he could remove it. Still, he went deeper, standing knee-deep in water, and filled buckets with soaked clay using a rope and pulley setup at the 3-6 meter mark. Once the flow evened out, he had truly arrived at the aquifer. As fresh water filtered through the sand and gravel, he checked its temperature with a thermometer he'd borrowed from the mining office. It read 11 degrees Celsius, matching the spring water's measurement perfectly. The stone lining was installed next. All spring long, Euan had gathered flat-filled stones, choosing ones that could be stacked closely with very little mortar. Working from the base upward, he stood in cold water while positioning each stone, shaping a cylinder about 0.9 meters in diameter. The lining was designed to hold the well in place, yet still permit groundwater to pass through the openings. It extended upward from the waterline all the way to ground level, where it connected with the cabin's floor. Careful planning went into the cabin's foundation. Around the well shaft, Euan constructed heavy timber sills, forming a frame to bear the floor, with a square gap of about 0.9 meters on each side left open above the water. From that central gap, the floor joists fanned outwards. The design allowed the structure to support typical weight while accommodating the unusual open area in the middle. Throughout July and August, the walls went up. Euan constructed them from hewn logs, sealing the cracks with clay and moss, yet his focus kept drifting back to the floor. He placed thick planks over the joists, saving the well opening for the end. A raised timber collar 20 centimeters high, was built around the shaft as a safety measure. Even with the cover off, the collar was meant to stop anyone from inadvertently stepping into the gap. The cover, however, demanded his greatest attention. The cover was constructed in 2 tiers, a lower framework of sturdy timber planks capable of bearing a person's weight, and an upper tier featuring 3 adjustable vents. A sliding wooden panel comprised each vent, which could be opened to create gaps for airflow, or shut to fully seal the well. Iron handles made operation simple. By late September, the whole assembly sat flush within the timber collar, level with the surrounding floor. At that point, the cabin, measuring about 4.9 by 6.1 meters, was finished. In the middle of the main room stood the well shaft, topped by its ventilated cover. Euan had situated the fireplace against the north wall, while the sleeping quarters were arranged on the south side. That placed the sleeping area closest to the well, where temperature stabilization was most pronounced. On the 5th of October, 1873, Euan opened all 3 vents for the first time. As his family looked on, cool, damp air drifted slowly upward from the shaft. Not a draft, but a gentle flow that brought the well-stable temperature into the room, where he positioned his thermometer near the floor. The thermometer registered 12 degrees Celsius from below, while the outside autumn air had fallen to 5 degrees Celsius. Morwenna placed her palm on the floor beside the well cover, sensing the gentle warmth emanating from the ground. "It isn't cold," she murmured. "It never will be," Euan responded, "so long as the water keeps flowing." By late October, the cabin belonging to Euan Triggeric was the talk of Houghton County. After work, miners would go out of their way to walk by and gawk at the house containing a well indoors. At the company boarding houses, men assembled to argue over the Cornish family's fate. Would they drown, contract fever from the moisture, or simply freeze once their unwise design proved unable to retain heat like a standard cabin? Attitudes had moved from mockery to real concern. "That ain't natural," one miner declared in the boarding house, warming himself by the stove. "A well should be out in the yard, not beneath your floor. He has water about 3 meters from where his kids sleep. One misstep at night, and they're done for." "Inside 2 years, that dampness will ruin his floor," another man concurred. "With all that moisture seeping up through the planks, the entire place will cave in before his children are grown. Then when the well water turns bad from having the house above it, they'll all perish from fever. Mind my words." Malcolm Sinclair toured the finished cabin in early October, strolling slowly through the main room as Euan described the ventilation system. Beside the well cover, the Scot had hunkered down, sensing the gentle heat coming up through the vents, and examined the design with reluctant admiration. "Clever work," Sinclair conceded. "I'll admit the cover is sturdy. The rim sits high enough to prevent a misstep. But October isn't the real trial. January is. At -34, and when you genuinely need heat, we'll see whether your well water helps at all. The water is indifferent to the Earth's behavior. 11 degrees in October, 11 in January. Aye, the aquifer has no sense of the calendar. And what about when the damp rising from that open shaft gives your children lung fever? When humidity decays your floor supports, you shut the vents when they aren't required. The lid forms a tight seal, allowing me to regulate the humidity coming into the room." Euan pointed to the sturdy timber frame. "These beams are white oak, set 20 centimeters above the shaft. They'll survive longer than you or me." One chilly evening in November, Morwenna's anxieties finally surfaced. She had been listening to the hushed worries of the other Cornish women at the Methodist chapel. "People claim we're dead in fate," Morwenna murmured, as she watched one adjust the well vents. "They say nothing good comes of residing over water, that ancient spirits curse anyone who builds above the deep places. The old spirits are back in Cornwall. They didn't come along to Míchigan. The other wives mentioned that their husbands smoke your well. They say we'll be pleading for refuge when illness arrives. That illness won't come. The water's clean, the lid's secure, and airflow stops moisture from gathering." A severe frost arrived on the 14th of November, and that evening Euan opened the well, vents completely, as outside temperatures fell to around -9 degrees Celsius. The household went to bed with a low banked fire, putting the system to the test. Euan woke at midnight and examined the thermometer. Near the door, the fire had collapsed to coals. The room was dark, apart from pale moonlight filtering through the frost-laced windows. Outside, the temperature had plunged to -13 degrees Celsius. Indoors, it read 8 degrees. He crossed to the well cover and placed his palm above an open vent. A soft warmth met his skin air at 11 degrees Celsius, streaming steadily off the water's surface, keeping the cabin temperate while the fire slumbered. He went back to bed without feeding the fire. The well had behaved precisely as physics required. By morning, the cabin still sat near 7 degrees Celsius, and the children had rested without shivering, under blankets but not smothered by them. Morwenna stayed silent, yet the look in her eyes had shifted. January 1874, came in with a harshness that even the most experienced miners found hard to remember. An Arctic air mass swept down from Canada on January 8th, pushing temperatures from a fairly mild minus 11 degrees Celsius down to minus 28 by midnight. By dawn the next day, the mercury had sunk to minus 33. On the morning of January 11th, the thermometer outside the Quincy mine office recorded minus 37 degrees Celsius, the lowest figure seen in Houghton County for more than 10 years. The wind compounded the danger. Gusts near 40 kilometers per hour pushed wind chill values past what anyone could withstand. Bare skin iced up in less than a minute, and horses without proper shelter perished on the spot. Rather than falling, the snow struck hurtling sideways over the frozen terrain, unimpeded in its onslaught from Lake Superior. All over the county, the frantic struggle to survive started. Malcolm Sinclair steadily consumed his neatly piled firewood at a frightening pace. His cabin's cast-iron stove stayed red-hot all day and night, yet frost still appeared on the interior walls. Away from the heat, his family dozed fully dressed, rousing every hour and a half to stoke the stove, groping through the icy dark. The draining cycle wore everyone out, and when the fire sank low before sunrise, the indoor temperature dropped to near freezing within 60 minutes. The Hendrickson family, living some 5 kilometers north, had it worse. Their chimney developed a crack on the second night, when the enormous swing between the blazing fire and the bitter cold split the mortar. Smoke filled the dwelling until they jammed racks into the crack, and even then the draft was spoiled. They used twice as much wood for half as much warmth, Ma wrapped in blankets while ice crept over the floor. A bachelor miner called Thomas Penrose exhausted his firewood supply on January 10th. He had misjudged the cold, laid in too little, and couldn't get anywhere near his neighbor's woodpile. They managed to reach him through the snowstorm the following afternoon, alive, but just barely. Inside the cabin, it was minus 6 degrees Celsius, and his fingers were discolored by frostbite. At the Triggeric cabin, with the stove cold and empty, January 8th began like any ordinary winter day. As always, Euan kept the fire going to maintain a pleasant warmth throughout the house during the day. Once evening arrived and the temperature fell dramatically, he opened the well vents completely. That ensured maximum heat exchange from the 11 degrees Celsius water below, and everything functioned just as it should. Even with the fire dying down during the night, the indoor temperature did not drop. The well's continuous warmth traveled up through the open vents, forming a thermal barrier that the frost couldn't get through. At 3 am, when only embers remained, and outside it was minus 37 degrees Celsius, the cabin still registered 6 degrees. Euan woke up at sunrise because of routine, not because of the chill. His children were still sleeping. Their blankets were pulled up, but their faces looked calm. Breath showed in the air, yet not the intense condensation of a freezing space. He looked at the thermometer. 5 degrees Celsius, cold for summer but survivable, and still comfortable compared with what his neighbors were going through. He lifted more wood onto the fire, and an hour later, the cabin had warmed back up to 16 degrees. But now he was absolutely certain. The fire was a luxury, not an essential. The well by itself would keep his family alive through any frost, any lack of wood, any crisis that left them without a flame. On January 12th, Malcolm Sinclair sent his eldest boy to make sure the Triggeric family was okay. The young man rode into the severe cold, certain he would find them crowded together and suffering just like everyone else. But he found Euan placidly splitting firewood outside the cabin. Through the window, he saw the children amusing themselves by the well cover, wearing no jackets inside. The younger Sinclair came back with a story that defied belief. The family with the well beneath their floor had more warmth than anyone else. Meanwhile, Malcolm Sinclair made his way to the Triggeric cabin on January 14th, 3 days after his son had brought that unbelievable report. Throughout that week, the Scotsman had hardly slept, continually feeding the fire to thaw frozen buckets, trying to soothe children who sobbed from the cold. His face was chapped and worn, his eyes sunken with tiredness, and his fingers still clumsy from a mild frostbite he'd got while hauling wood in the blizzard. He saw Euan outside, stacking logs without the slightest hurry. Sinclair noticed right off that the Cornishman's woodpile didn't look much smaller, despite a week of the most brutal cold anyone could remember. "Show me," he said without any further words. "Show me how you made it through." Euan invited him inside, and the Scotsman froze on the third step, his body taking in what his brain couldn't accept. The air was pleasant, not hot exactly, but absolutely not the kind of freezing agony he'd endured in his own home. There was no fire burning in the fireplace, and yet the room stayed at a comfortable, consistent temperature. "Where is this heat coming from?" Sinclair demanded in a whisper. "From beneath." Euan crossed to the well cover at the center of the room and indicated the open vents. "Put your hand over the vent opening." Crouching low, Sinclair placed his palm above one of the vents. A soft, continuous warmth met his skin, barely perceptible yet clear, an air current noticeably hotter than the cabin air. 11 degrees Celsius, Euan clarified. The water down there remains at a constant 11 degrees no matter the season. Whenever the cabin air cools below that, warmth ascends through these openings. Thanks to the well, the temperature never falls below about 7 degrees Celsius, even without any fire. That can't be right. Water freezes. Only water on the surface freezes. Deep groundwater remains unaffected by the cold, thanks to the complete insulation of the earth. Euan pulled a notebook off one of the shelves and turned to the pages dedicated to the cold spell. Sinclair's hands shook as he accepted the notebook, in which Euan had logged the temperature every 4 hours since the freeze began. The records were precise. Exterior and interior readings, fire state, vent placement. On January 11, the outside temperature read minus 37 degrees Celsius. The fire had been out for 6 hours, the vents were fully open, and inside it was 5 degrees Celsius. The following day, with the outside at minus 36, the fire dead for 4 hours, and the vents still fully open, the interior had climbed to 6 degrees. You intentionally allowed your fire to go out completely, Sinclair said deliberately, at minus 37 degrees, just to put your system to the test. That's insane. I had to learn whether the well alone would sustain us. It kept us above 4 degrees Celsius for 6 hours without any fire. It could have maintained that temperature forever. The aquifer is vast, tens of thousands of liters of water at 11 degrees Celsius, continually refreshed by groundwater. Its thermal capacity is practically unlimited. Sinclair shut the notebook and surveyed the cabin. The children were playing beside the well cover in ordinary clothes, in stark contrast to the heavy winter layers his own kids had to wear around the clock. At the table, Morwenna was preparing a meal with her sleeves rolled up, clearly at ease. "We haven't been properly warm in 7 days, Sinclair admitted in a low voice. "We've used 10 cubic meters of firewood and frost still forms on our floors." "His little one has had a cough for 4 days now, from sleeping in the cold," Sinclair said. Euan went to a shelf and took down a jar of honey, along with a bunch of dried herbs intended to soothe the cough. "Morwenna will teach your wife the recipe. I called you a fool." Looking directly at Euan, Sinclair addressed the room. "You could have drowned your children or killed them from fever, but you didn't know any better. How could you? You had never witnessed water being used like that. Now I have." Sinclair offered his hand. "Could you teach me how to construct one?" Euan gave it a firm shake. "Once the ground thaws, we'll trace your water table and keep digging until we strike it." The next person to stop by after Malcolm Sinclair was the miner whose fingers had turned black due to frostbite. On the 16th of January, Thomas Penrose turned up, his hand wrapped in bandages and his ego deeply wounded. Holding his hat, he stood at the Triggeric entrance. "Sinclair spoke to me about your well," he said. "He told me your cabin stayed above 4 degrees Celsius without any fire lit. 3 nights back, I almost died after my wood supply gave out. I have to know how you managed it." Euan invited him in without a moment's delay, and Penrose remained there for an hour, kneeling next to the well cover, his hands still bandaged. Leaning over the air vents, he felt the soft heat that had kept the family alive when the fire gave out. "It's almost as if the earth is breathing out warm air." In a low voice, Penrose said, "I've spent 15 years working below ground and never thought of tapping the heat that way. In the mines, I learned that every flooded tunnel and pump room stayed at a steady temperature. I simply brought that principle up to the surface." By the end of January, Euan had welcomed 19 visitors to his cabin, including miners, farmers, and merchants. Even the company physician, who had come to evaluate whether an indoor well could be dangerous, knelt next to the vents. When he felt the heat rising from beneath, he left wearing the same shocked look. After the inspection, the doctor said the water was clean and the air no more humid than in a normal ventilated home. Malcolm Sinclair was the first to commit himself to building a similar system. He showed up in early March with his 2 oldest sons and notebooks ready, eager to learn everything Euan had to teach. "The most important thing is the water table," Euan explained as he led them around Sinclair's land to pick the right spot. "You need stable groundwater, not surface runoff. Look for hillside springs, they show you where the aquifer runs. Dig where the soil is still wet even after dry summers." He then spent 4 days teaching them how to construct the well, line it with stone, and fashion an appropriate cover. He explained how to design the ventilation, adjust the size of the vents to transfer heat efficiently without creating too much humidity, and put together the safety collar that kept small children from falling in. "You're giving everything away," Morwenna said one evening after another group had left carrying pages of diagrams. "Knowledge that's kept hidden dies with the one who keeps it," Euan replied. "In Cornwall, we miners shared what we learned because sharing kept men alive. If I store this secret away, some family would freeze next winter for no reason. If I share it, the knowledge spreads, and more children wake up warm." The first new installation began at the Sinclair farm in late April. As soon as the ground had thawed enough to dig, Euan oversaw the job himself, checking the depth of the water table, testing the temperature of the groundwater, making sure the stone lining was secure, and confirming the cover let in proper airflow. Sinclair and his sons supplied the labor while the Cornishman made every decision. By the time summer ended, 4 indoor wells were being built somewhere in Houghton County. Mikko Korhonen, a Finnish immigrant, altered the plan for a smaller cabin by using a thinner shaft and larger vents to make up for the size. A widow named Sarah Hendrickson had workers dig a well underneath her current cabin and cut through her floor to install the system. If they'd learned about this earlier, her husband might not have lost his fingers. In September, the Hancock newspaper published a piece on the Cornish technique for regulating heat. Letters came in from all over the Upper Peninsula, Wisconsin, and Minnesota settlers anxious for any kind of protection against winters that kill mercilessly. Euan wrote back to each one, including sketches, explanations of the basic principles, and a step-by-step construction guide. He didn't charge a penny. The ground's heat belongs to everybody standing on it, he told Sinclair. I only taught people how to reach down and take it. Euan Triggeric stayed on that Houghton County homestead another 31 years. He passed away in 1904, surrounded by children and grandchildren who had grown up playing next to a well cover that breathed warmth into the house. In all those winters, Euan never woke up in a frozen cabin after the fire went out. The original well kept working until 1947, when his great-grandson finally sealed it after installing a modern furnace. The shaft was still producing clean water at about 11 degrees Celsius, the same temperature it had when Euan first tested it 74 years before. For years, the winter of 1874 stayed the standard for comparing every later Upper Peninsula winter. Veterans would query one another whether it matched 74, yet the reply was seldom affirmative. Even so, milder winters continued to claim settlers who lacked sufficient firewood and brought children to premature deaths due to cold sickness. They also serve as a reminder of Euan's demonstration. No cabin needed to freeze over. CAM 1885 indoor thermal wells extended past Houghton County to adjacent Keweenaw, Ontonagon, and Baraga counties. Engineers from mining firms examined the concept and started applying comparable layouts to pump stations and equipment sets.
Farming periodicals ran pieces on the Cornish technique for regulating groundwater temperature. In 1891, the Michigan Agricultural Extension asked Euan to address their winter conference.
This immigrant, previously ridiculed for constructing above water, was now speaking to a crowd of 200 farmers eager for insights that could change how they faced winter. The ground loses its winter chill around 3 meters down, with his Cornish accent still strong after 20 years in the US. Euan explained that groundwater preserved that recollection, about 11 degrees Celsius, reliably year after year. For centuries, anyone with a borehole has had a thermal store beneath them. The real choice is whether to exploit it or disregard it. Following the construction of his indoor well, Malcolm Sinclair saw no further relatives die from cold-related conditions. His property turned into a showcase for the approach, drawing visitors from all over the Upper Peninsula to experience warm air flowing up through vents in the floor. That January, he and his sons erected their own homes, making the Cornish method the norm. 4 generations of the Sinclair family stayed in Houghton County, each rooted in the steady heat of the earth. Principal Euan recognized that leveraging groundwater stable temperature for indoor climate control is now seen in geothermal systems around the globe. Today's ground source heat pumps move fluid through underground coils to draw out the ground's consistent temperature, providing warmth in winter and air conditioning in summer. Although compressors and heat exchangers have improved the hardware, the fundamental principle is the same. At sufficient depth, the ground remains constant no matter the weather above, and that steadiness is there for anyone willing to reach for it. Euan's insight, shared by countless Cornish miners, was that the chaotic temperature shifts on the surface form only a thin crust over thermal consistency. His neighbors battled the atmosphere. The outside environment shifted constantly, yet he fixed himself to the water, which remained utterly unchanged. Though the place and season were identical, the results diverged dramatically. Morwenna survived Euan by 8 years. She passed her last winters in the cabin they had built as a team, with warm air still flowing up through the same vents her husband had cut. The well continued to release roughly 11 degrees Celsius into rooms that had not frozen once in 30-plus years. Following her death, her daughter discovered a note hidden inside the family Bible, penned in Morwenna's precise Cornish handwriting. He told me the water would keep us warm. I feared he would drown our children. The water provided warmth through 30 icy winters. Our kids matured without ever experiencing a freezing home at daybreak. He reached into the ground and drew out heat that never let us down. The earth honors its commitments to those who listen carefully. The well has been sealed for ages. Yet the aquifer continues to flow at approximately 11 degrees Celsius. Steady and unaltered, it remains ready for whoever is shrewd enough to take hold of it.